On February 22, 2026, Mexican Army Special Forces moved into the mountain town of Talpa in the state of Jalisco. Their target was Nemio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, the founder and head of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG. Authorities had been tracking him for years. On that Sunday, the search ended. The operation did not go as cleanly as a straightforward arrest. Mexican forces attempted to take El Mencho alive. A shootout broke out. He was wounded during the exchange, and forces began airlifting him toward Mexico City for medical treatment. He died before reaching the hospital. Mexican authorities immediately placed this outcome alongside the capture of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman as a landmark moment in the country's fight against organized crime. That framing was not casual. El Chapo had defined an era of cartel dominance. Measuring El Mencho against that benchmark reflected how thoroughly CJNG had embedded itself into the structure of Mexican criminal power over the years of his leadership. U.S. agencies contributed intelligence support to the operation. This was not a spontaneous act of cooperation. It reflected a deliberate and sustained shift in how Washington engaged with Mexico City on the cartel issue, driven by political pressure to target leadership directly rather than focus solely on drug seizures or lower-level arrests. The intelligence that located El Mencho in Talpa reportedly came through the same kind of reconnaissance that had been used in other high-value targeting operations. El Mencho had operated for years as what authorities described as a ghost boss with no public appearances, almost no current photographs, and a base in rural strongholds that made physical location difficult. He was believed to be around 59 years old at the time of his death. The U.S. had placed a reward of $10 to $15 million on information leading to his capture, and he faced multiple federal indictments including drug trafficking, weapons charges, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise under the Kingpin Act. His family had already been substantially weakened by prior law enforcement action. His son was extradited to the United States, convicted and sentenced to life in a supermax facility in Florence, Colorado. His daughter pleaded guilty to money laundering and Kingpin Act violations and was released in 2022. Other relatives were reported to be in U.S. custody. By the time El Mencho died, the family network was no longer a viable succession path. The operation closed one chapter. What opened immediately after it was something the Mexican government had not fully prepared the public for. CJNG's response came fast. Within hours of the announcement of El Mencho's death, cartel cells activated across multiple states. Buses and vehicles were set on fire. Major highways and city roads were blocked. Attacks hit businesses and infrastructure. Guadalajara partially shut down. Residents across Jalisco stayed indoors. Puerto Vallarta, a coastal city that draws heavy international tourism, including large numbers of Americans, became the most visible flashpoint. Tourists found themselves confined to their hotels. The airport suspended operations entirely. Commercial airlines halted all flights in and out of the city. What had been, by most accounts, one of Mexico's most peaceful and visited destinations was suddenly cut off. U.S. diplomatic missions issued shelter-in-place advisories for Americans in the affected regions. The State Department advised all American citizens to avoid traveling to Mexico until authorities restored order. That guidance carried immediate weight for travel plans, hotel bookings, and airline routes across the country. Approximately 30 deaths were reported in connection with the retaliatory violence. No American citizens were confirmed among them, but the geographic reach of the disruption extended well beyond any single incident. By Monday, Puerto Vallarta's airport began resuming operations. Visible violence in the city had subsided, but the significance of what had just happened extended beyond the specific events. CJNG had demonstrated, within hours of losing its founder, that it retained the organizational capacity to execute a coordinated, multi-state response. That was the point of the retaliation, not the damage itself, but the proof of continued capability. The cartel had a documented history of this kind of response. Public, rapid retaliation following leadership losses was part of how CJNG communicated its position to the government and to rival organizations. The message was structural. Disrupting the top of the organization does not disable what the organization can do. That message landed at a moment when the Mexican government was attempting to frame the Jalisco operation as a turning point. The retaliation complicated that framing in real time. The retaliation was possible because of how Mencho built CJNG, not around himself as an irreplaceable center, but through a network of regional cells and semi-autonomous units operating across Mexican states. Each unit pledged loyalty to central leadership but maintained its own operational capacity. When the center was struck, the units did not wait for new orders. They acted. This decentralized structure was a deliberate design choice. Older cartel models built tight hierarchies that were vulnerable to exactly the kind of targeted removal that the Jalisco operation represented. CJNG evolved past that vulnerability by distributing authority downward while maintaining a unified identity and brand. Regional plaza bosses controlled their own territories, their own resources, and their own enforcement capacity. The cartel's economic model reinforced this structure. CJNG's activities extended well beyond drug trafficking, though that remained the core. Extortion of local businesses, control of fuel distribution networks, kidnapping operations, and reported ownership of legitimate businesses, including pharmacies, gave the organization multiple revenue streams embedded in local economies. These streams did not depend on Mencho's direct involvement. They ran through the regional commanders who managed them day to day. Fentanyl distribution into the United States represented a significant and growing portion of CJNG's trafficking operations, directly connected to overdose deaths affecting American communities at a scale of approximately 100,000 annually. That social infrastructure, the compliance, the embedded economics, the regional command structure is what survived Mencho's death intact. The operation in Jalisco removed the man who built it. It did not remove what he built. The scale of CJNG's capacity invites comparison to other criminal organizations, particularly the Italian-American Mafia. That comparison surfaces frequently, but it obscures more than it clarifies. The two organizations were built for different purposes, on different economic foundations, and with fundamentally different relationships to state power. Michael Franzese, who grew up in the Colombo crime family where his father served as underboss, and who was himself active in that life for more than 2 decades, addresses this distinction directly. His position is not academic. He draws on direct experience with how the American Mafia operated, what it valued, and what it explicitly prohibited. The prohibition on drug dealing was one of the organization's defining rules during his era. Members were told clearly that involvement in drug trafficking carried a death sentence within the organization. Some violated that rule covertly, but the rule existed and was enforced. Franzese references Paul Castellano's move against John Gotti as a specific illustration. Castellano used reported drug dealing within Gotti's crew as justification for attempting to eliminate him. The rule had teeth. The Mafia's strategic posture was built around invisibility, not confrontation. It worked through infiltration of labor unions, local politics, and legitimate businesses, not through the accumulation of military-grade firepower. That posture was not a limitation imposed from outside. It reflected what the organization was designed to do. Building a paramilitary force capable of fighting the government would, have made the mafia a direct threat to the state in ways that would have produced a level of law enforcement response the organization could not have survived. Operating in the shadows, by contrast, allowed it to sustain itself for decades. Franzese draws a further distinction regarding Italy. He acknowledges that the Italian mafia did engage more directly in heroin trafficking. The Pizza Connection case involved Italian-origin operators moving drugs through pizza establishments in the United States. But he separates that from the American organization, noting that those individuals came from Italy and that American leadership was not supposed to be involved. The cartels started from a completely different premise. Drug revenue was not a side activity that some members pursued illegally. It was the founding economic logic of the organization. The billions generated by cocaine and methamphetamine trafficking gave CJNG the resources to build something the mafia never attempted, a force capable of confronting the Mexican military in open engagement, with armored vehicles, heavy weapons, and coordinated tactical capacity. That military capability changed the cartel's relationship to the state entirely. Where the mafia sought to avoid direct conflict with the government, CJNG built the capacity to absorb it and respond to it publicly. The aftermath of El Mencho's death was a direct expression of that capacity, not a sign of weakness, but a demonstration of what the organization could still do after losing its founder. The removal of El Mencho produced a clear set of outcomes for different factors, and those outcomes do not all point in the same direction. For the Mexican government, the operation produced something it had struggled to demonstrate for years: the willingness and ability to strike at the top of a major cartel's leadership. Years of criticism had centered on the perception that the government had made an implicit accommodation with the cartels, choosing stability over confrontation. The Jalisco operation challenged that perception directly. It also came at a moment when Mexico was preparing to host high-profile international events, including World Cup matches, making a visible security success politically useful beyond the cartel context. For the United States, the result validated a specific approach. The intelligence sharing model, where U.S. agencies provide targeting information that Mexican forces act on, had now produced a result that could be pointed to in bilateral discussions. It gave proponents of that model concrete evidence that coordinated pressure on cartel leadership could work. Those gains, however, were immediate and symbolic. The structural conditions that gave CJNG its power did not change with El Mencho's death. Local security forces in Jalisco and neighboring states now face elevated risk. When a cartel retaliates following a leadership loss, the targets are not random. Police stations, military patrols, and government infrastructure in CJNG-heavy regions become more vulnerable to the kind of attacks the cartel uses to signal continued strength. That risk is sustained, not temporary. Civilians in CJNG-dominated areas face a different kind of exposure. The internal competition for succession between regional plaza bosses, between CJNG and the Sinaloa cartel, and potentially between CJNG factions and local gangs, produces violence that spreads through communities without necessarily targeting them. Blockades restrict movement. Conflict near commercial areas forces businesses to close. People who have no involvement in cartel activity absorb the consequences of the power struggle around them. Tourism in Puerto Vallarta and across Jalisco faces an uncertain timeline. A State Department advisory against travel to Mexico does not expire on a fixed schedule. It lifts when the security situation is assessed as stable, and that assessment depends on conditions that are still developing. For a city whose economy depends heavily on international visitors, the period of uncertainty carries real economic weight regardless of how quickly visible violence subsides. The specific question now is not whether CJNG survives. The organization's decentralized structure and embedded regional operations make outright collapse unlikely in the near term. The question is what form it takes going forward and what violence accompanies that transition. With El Mencho's family largely removed from the succession picture, the transition falls to internal figures, regional commanders, and plaza bosses who already control territory and resources. Whether one of them emerges with enough authority to consolidate the organization, or whether the absence of clear central leadership produces factional competition, will shape the pattern of violence over the coming months. The Sinaloa cartel represents the most significant external variable. It has the organizational scale and geographic presence to move into corridors and territories that CJNG previously controlled. That kind of territorial expansion would not be passive. It would involve direct confrontation with CJNG units defending their positions. The result would be sustained violence in contested areas, not a clean transfer of control. Smaller local groups operating within CJNG territory face a narrower set of options. Large cartels historically do not tolerate independent criminal operations within areas they control. Whatever reorganization follows El Mencho's death is unlikely to produce genuine openings for smaller actors. Drug flows into the United States will continue. The trafficking infrastructure, the routes, the contacts, the distribution networks, the relationships with suppliers exists independently of any single leader. It was built over years and operates through the regional structure that CJNG put in place. Fentanyl, cocaine, and methamphetamine will continue moving through those channels regardless of who holds authority over the organization that controls them. Mexican authorities may increase military presence in Jalisco and surrounding states in the short term. That presence can suppress visible conflict and reduce the immediate risk of retaliatory attacks on government personnel and infrastructure. What it cannot do on its own is resolve the underlying power competition that El Mencho's death has set in motion. The operation in Jalisco accomplished something specific and measurable. Whether it marks the beginning of a sustained shift in the balance between the Mexican state and the cartels depends entirely on what comes next, and that is still unfolding. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the fall of El Mencho and the cartel war that followed, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.